Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to the panel. Apologies for starting slightly late. We were just trying to sort out something with the microphones. So in order to allow as much audience participation as possible. So just to remind you that this is the panel entitled Mission Impossible Towards Big Data Governance. And we'll be running this until around 12:30. My name's Anne Alexander, and I am coordinator of the Digital Humanities Network here in Cambridge, which is a research network spanning the university, involving researchers basically at any end of a collision between the digital and the human. So people who are interested in digital culture and society, but also technologists and people working from a computer science background. I'll be moderating the panel, and we're very lucky to have a number of extremely talented and interesting speakers who will be starting off by giving a very brief introduction to, or a set of reactions to the panel description. On my right, I have Claudia Lopes, who is from Africa's Voices, a research foundation, and I think all the panel speakers will say a little bit about themselves before they begin. At the far end, I have Andrew Gruen, who tells me that he is more ginger than the next speaker, who is Joseph Bonneau, and they will both be also introducing themselves and giving a sense of their different perspectives on this question. So to start with, I'd like to turn to Claudia.
Okay. Thank you, Anne, and thanks for the opportunity to be here in this panel today. So I will focus on the aspects of data governance in Africa. I'm head of research and innovation at Africa Voices Foundation, that is a startup that spun out of the Center of Governance and Human Rights here at the University of Cambridge. We work with organizations in Africa, such as UNICEF and Oxfam, to listen to communities, to understand what are their priorities and their worldviews, and give back this information to the organizations so they can best serve the beneficiaries in terms of programming and in terms of, for example, advising and recommendations for policy change. So I'm going to focus particularly on the digital data that is generated by African citizens as part of their everyday communications. For example, in radio forums where audiences can participate in by sending their opinions using SMSs or voice calls. So at Africa Voices Foundation, we work, for example, in Somalia with radio stations broadcasting to half of the territory across 60 districts, including remote and very insecure areas. We reach nomadic populations, we reach women who don't normally have a voice in the public arena. Last year, we worked with UNICEF to gather opinions of Somali citizens about child and maternal health and their opinions about polio vaccination. We gathered messages from over 8,000 people, 44% were women. We analyzed 20,000 messages and structured noisy data in Somali dialects. In terms of volume, we can think that maybe this is not big data, but it's a different type of data that researchers are used to work with. So using this and structured and noisy data, we try to understand what are the cultural beliefs of Somalis in different regions of Somalia, and what are their opinions about polio vaccinations. For example, we found that the word for polio in Somali is dabayesha, that means wind, and people who live in rural areas, they think that they are immune to polio because they breathe clean air. Last year, the UN updated its roadmap and agreed over 17 overarching sustainable development goals to tackle poverty and fight inequality until 2030. This new agenda brought on unique opportunity to harness the data revolution for sustainable development. But for the sustainable development goals to be realized and correctly monitored, we need to ensure the best use of this type of data. But there is good news for those who seek to harness big data for social good. The development community is not starting from scratch, so it can adapt innovative tools and methods that have been used and tested in the private sector. There are particularities, however, with this type of approach. In international development, there are issues of agency, legitimacy, and representation that are very different from other contexts. For example, the audiences with which we are engaging during radio forums may not be in a position to make informed choices and understand what is informed consent and what will be the uses of this type of data. Often, these communities are already lacking vital services and are not enabled to access the basic human rights. So they may not be aware of the implications of their data being collected or used and have little or no awareness of their digital rights and even less power to influence the process of data gathering. The focus on the broader societal benefits of working on good causes sometimes contributes to avoiding a more critical discussion of how the data is managed or used and whether they leave communities worse off after an intervention that gathered data ended. Also, data is a very powerful tool to tell stories about people's lives and what their reality is. So we need to understand how the insights that are drawn from the data may impact people's lives and be responsible in the ways that we use and present the conclusions to the civil society or governance actors. And people who are not heard lead to biases and exclusions in this type of conclusions. So this kind of data exclusions may perpetuate social inequalities. So we need to ask ourselves who is not heard and whose realities are not reflected in the data, and what is the impact of these exclusions when using data to inform programs, advocacy, or policy change. And finally, there's also the accuracy aspect. It is about ensuring that the right questions are being asked and the right data is being gathered. And for that, we need strong design and very robust methods to analyze, to gather, and to generate insights from data. Some African governments have already launched their own open data initiatives, and new data ecosystems are emerging. So I don't think the mission is impossible, and I think we have reasons to be positive. There are some networks emerging, such as the Open Data Partnership for Responsible Data for Sustainable Development Goals and the Responsible Data Initiative from Civicus. But my last statement, I think, is related with the importance of equipping students, NGOs, organizations, in terms of data analysis, tools, and knowledge. So we can the data can be open. We need to have discoverable algorithms, but we need to have people that are very well equipped to generate valid insights from this data and understand all the ethical implications and use robust methods.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks. I'll pass over to you.
Okay. So I guess I'll just say a few words about what I do and how I've interacted with these issues. So I'm a computer scientist. I did my PhD here at the Computer Lab. And for the last, academically I worked on cryptography and computer security. For about the last year I've been working as a technology fellow at an NGO called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is based in San Francisco. So at EFF, my job is really to work with the lawyers. They have really smart lawyers there who understand tech really well. And my job is to support them mostly in court or going through various legal proceedings with the government, various governments around the world, mostly the US government, but sometimes others, as well as big companies, often around how data is being collected, how data is being used. And specifically, for the last couple of years, the main item that's soaked up most resources has been surveillance in the US, as well as a few other places. So, for example, I spent about 2 months this year working on the Apple versus FBI dispute that took place in the United States around unlocking a specific phone of a specific person in this San Bernardino bombing. So that was kind of like a 2-month project that I worked on with basically myself and a team of about 10 lawyers plus some activists relaying the whole thing to the public. So just putting that out there because that probably shapes the way I think about big data, which is mostly in a mass surveillance context. So the issues there are a little bit different, I think, sometimes than data that's collected for research or for other purposes. The consequences are a little bit starker. It's more clear, I think, that the data subjects have not, it's much harder to argue that they've given consent in any kind of way, informed or otherwise. So I guess I can fill the role on this panel of being the more pessimistic one and saying that it's big data governance is very, very hard. These kind of cases are very, very hard to win in the court of public opinion, and they're really hard to win legally. The U.S. gets probably the most attention for having really opaque legal protections around surveillance, and I sadly can tell you that we know a lot more about the U.S. situation because of Ed Snowden and because for various other reasons there have been more leaks and the media has focused on them more. But essentially everything we know about other countries, including in the EU, but also places like China, governments in the Middle East, the situation for citizens protecting their data from government surveillance is even worse. There's much less legal oversight. The U.S. Sort of has the semblance of a court. It may be a secret court, but there is at least some process somewhere where people are trying to think about what they're doing and whether or not it complies with some set of rules that they've often twisted and are interpreting in strange ways. A lot of other countries, there's no rules, there's no semblance of a court. It's basically just whatever intelligence agencies think needs to be happening at that time, including the UK. The UK is the other country where I know the landscape somewhat well. I guess for those of you who hopefully people have followed the news and seen that Theresa May became the new prime minister. For I think a lot of people, maybe Theresa May wasn't on the radar. Interestingly for us, I actually went and talked to my old research group yesterday here in Cambridge. Theresa May has been sort of an open enemy of that research group for a long time. She's been maybe the single politician in the UK most in favor of surveillance, in favor of giving more power to GCHQ and other agencies in the UK. So it was kind of a particularly tough moment for the group because this individual who's done the most, certainly from the Conservative Party, to push surveillance. She's been the main architect behind the IP, the Investigatory Powers Bill, is now kind of in charge of the whole government. So I'd say that the forecast in the UK is pretty grim right now for the side of civil liberties and reining in surveillance. So that's probably enough background. I'm happy to, if people want to talk more in that direction, I'm happy to talk, as much length as people are interested about surveillance, other government collection of data, and sort of the role companies play in that.
Thanks, and we'll now move to Andrew.
So now for something completely different, yet again. So very nice to see everyone. I come at this question from a maybe not completely orthogonal angle, but close. I was here and did sociology. I worked as a reporter prior to that and had done a lot of work in kind of the technology and business of journalism. And that's not why I'm here. I wanted to add a different kind of data and a different kind of perspective on what we can do with extremely large quantities, particularly in the biomedical space. So unlike most of the rooms that I find myself in, I suspect that a lot of us in this room do know about genomics and sequencing. Yes. We raise our hands. Yes, we know about sequencing. Awesome. Okay. Good. So I don't need to do any of the typical explanations. What the perspective that I was hoping actually to spark a bit of conversation about is, so we're moving in a direction where we finally have enough of the basic plumbing and technology to collect all sorts of omics and to add to them electronic medical records and other items. One of the projects that I'm involved with now is trying to collect data from 1 million individuals in the US. And so the conversation that I think actually might be an interesting one that spans between the previous two speakers is about, so we have this most personal data of yours, your actual genome, and then what ends up happening with that data? How do we decide how and where we can use it? Because there's a bit of a paradox in large-scale genomic research, which is that I can only understand you in the context of millions of others. So I really can't learn terribly much about you. I can't provide for you a more precise treatment. I can't learn what your variations mean without this large context of many, 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 many other people. And so when we put all these bits together, how do we do that? There are interesting, for those who are computer science type folks, there's interesting data structures that a lot of people are now trying to use to combine these data while keeping individuals anonymous and kind of letting us do that learning. So I, just because we're kind of already pretty short on time, I'll kind of stop the introductory statement there, but my interest then would be in, okay, so when we have biomedical data and we have extremely large quantities of it, as you all know, say on the order of 500 gigs per individual sequenced, when we put it all together, what do we do with it? How do we do with it? How do we actually manage that level of data? And then how do we make our choices about those combinations?
Thank you. And as you can see, obviously, we have a very wide range of perspectives. I should say very briefly a little bit about my research, which is largely, the big data angle of it is largely focused on the use of social media data. So I study social movements, in particular in the Middle East, and in the context of, particularly in the context of the media that's generated by those movements and about those movements, and a changing overall landscape of the media of the region and beyond. And therefore, the questions around ethics and governance in relation to that data are ones that usually arise both on a quantitative scale, in terms of how do you make sense of very varied types of data produced by millions of people in very different contexts and traveling through different platforms, some of which are located in the region, in a country like Egypt or in countries like Syria, and others where the infrastructure which is helping to generate those interactions or those interactions are taking place across is a third-party, large corporate entity, mainly based in the US often, if you're talking about the big internet giants, or at any rate they're anchored in the US, even though these are transnational concerns. And I have some of the same interests to Joseph in relation to questions around surveillance and privacy, with often where in terms of the consequences for, say, individuals being targeted through surveillance programs in a country like Egypt can be even more catastrophic than in places like the US and the UK, because you're talking about an enormously repressive state apparatus and non-existent, really, rule of law or proper judicial processes for people who are accused of crimes by the state. So that's the perspective and the background that I would be bringing to the discussion. What I'd like to do is pose a few questions to my other panelists, and we'll go round and take some answers, and then we'll open up to bring in your questions and comments. So my first point, which I'd like to put to everybody, is: so in your area of work, who is being irresponsible with data, and why do you think so? Perhaps we'll start with Claudia.
So I think in the research projects that we do, I think we are all responsible for the data. So we don't make a distinction about people who manipulate data and people who think about, who design projects and think about the implications and the impact of this kind of research insights. So I think the ethics of data. Sorry. Sorry. I think maybe I cannot talk now. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Let me pass over.
Okay.
Has a quick drink.
Sure. I think Silicon Valley is being irresponsible, which is where I live and work. A lot of my friends are. I think some of the most interesting things that have come out of everything we've learned about the way modern intelligence works the last couple of years. Most of what's been achieved has really been built on the back of companies that are collecting data. So things like the PRISM program, that was really just about letting government intelligence tap into all the data that Gmail, Microsoft, Yahoo, Twitter, whoever were already collecting. And it's a much simpler problem for them to just breach the security of these companies that already have massive databases of information about their user rather than having to collect it all in the first place. So that example is like relatively well known. The other thing that came out in the Snowden docs that I think wasn't as appreciated by the public. So for tracking people's internet browsing and building up a profile, one piece of information that's very useful about you is just the complete set of all websites that you go to. It reveals a lot of information about you. Most of you think, you can think about, would you really want the entire public to know every website that you've ever visited? You can think about what that would say about you and how it might change other people's perceptions of you. It should have been a big technical hurdle for intelligence agencies to get over, to figure out all the different websites that you visit, given that you use different browsers, you use different machines, et cetera. The advertising industry has already solved that problem. So they want to be able to put together your entire browsing history so that they can serve ads to you in a slightly more efficient way, get you to click on slightly more ads. As a byproduct of that, multiple intelligence agencies now just piggyback on that. So they just use the same tracking cookies. They just have to hack into one or a couple of databases that these very sort of unscrupulous advertising companies keep. And then they can say, okay, this is Joe's entire, these are the cookie IDs that correspond to Joe. Boom, we can sort of now cross-correlate all the different websites that he goes to. And again, that's really building off of work that Silicon Valley has already essentially done for them to build up this apparatus to do it, and then not taken any effort to really secure it, which is very, very difficult to do. So most companies, especially startups, don't have the kind of security expertise to really defend against government-level attackers. It's kind of an impossible ask of them. And they're also not even thinking about it. I mean, they're trying to survive and trying to get to the next round of funding, trying not to get sued out of into oblivion in some cases. So it's strange because we've sort of allowed this entire ecosystem of companies to spring up whose goal is to collect a lot of data, and then that data makes its way into the hands of government, and that's sort of been the mechanism we've seen.
So Andrew.
Sure, yeah. So I actually have a question for you, and
Sure.
I'll explain the basis of it by way of answering your question. So my question is really about technological versus policy reactions, and where you are most interested in applying effort, because the EFF is in this interesting space of doing a little bit of both. So that's my question. And this comes from, in response to yours, who's being irresponsible? I emphatically don't like the term irresponsible for the space that I work in. I would say that as the entire space has not built great, easy technical tools that allow people to be clearly responsible with the data. I mean, as anyone who's ever used a university information system, right, people forget that they logged in and they left a document on there, and what happens if instead you forgot and you left someone's genome on that machine? I mean, the sad thing is that it actually happens all the time, and that as we, as a software company, are working on building really simple tools like authenticating each individual user instead of an entire lab, that this is new, is kind of, yes, exactly, right? Like, and so, or that you would have your own account instead of using your PI's account to access controlled access data in, for example, TCGA, a giant genomic database, right? Like these are new ideas, is a bit surprising. So is it irresponsible? No. Have we kind of failed to provide these technical tools? Absolutely yes. But then that goes, because I think it's, in the case of the EFF, it's squarely where you sit. And so I'm wondering kind of how if you got to push on, which lever would you push on first and how?
Oh, policy versus technical?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that EFF is trying to push on both. So, like, I guess just to talk about the advertising cookie issue that I mentioned, I mean, EFF both puts out a browser extension called Privacy Badger, which you should all download and try, which will delete a lot of tracking cookies from your browser, so it will make you harder to track. Definitely not a bulletproof solution. And at the same time, are kind of constantly in court over the use of advertising cookies sort of pushing the industry to be more regulated or reform itself. So I mean, the easy answer is that it's always like a two-pronged approach because we're trying to do everything that we can.
Yeah. But you have to, I mean, you're limited resources. Like, what do you do? And how do you, I mean, because there's all kinds of conversation now, especially about things like differential privacy, which all of a sudden everyone's heard of, which before no one had heard of.
Right.
And so is fancy math our solution?
At the end of the day, like, no, I don't think fancy math.
Yeah.
I'm a cryptographer, so it's a definite failing of our field that we think we can sort of ride in and solve people's problems with like a slightly cleverer, more clever algorithm.
Yeah.
To me, differential privacy largely falls into that. I think it's fascinating. I've published papers on differential privacy, and it's a great research area. But
does everyone know this, by the way? Did we just go off in a rant?
Okay, so it's a total buzzword. It gained more buzz last month because Apple announced that they're going to use differential privacy. Their thing kind of fell apart when people asked technical follow-up questions like, awesome, what algorithm are you using? What data are you applying it to? They're like, we'll figure that out. We're just like, we're going to do it. Differential privacy, we're on that train.
Maybe we could just I'd like to come back
Okay,
to
sure,
the tech
sorry.
versus policy
can
points. That's definitely a line I'd like to follow. But I'd like to just quickly come back to.
Yeah, thank you.
I was
Yeah.
interrupted
Sorry.
by
Okay.
coughing.
Yeah,
So-
thank you. So I was just talking about responsible data in this context of citizen-generated data. And as Africa Voices, we have privacy, very stringent kind of principles, and we have a framework for responsible data that with guidelines that we follow. But this data travels across different type of factors. So the data comes from the audiences that, for example, listen to radio programs in Africa, or they use digital platforms. And it goes to for example, SMS platform and the data is hosted there. So we normally ask about the framework, the data privacy framework of SMS platform, that they are not always available. So there's a kind of a black box as where is the next step that the data is going before it comes to us. And then this data doesn't belong to us. So this data belongs to the organizations we are working with. And we have been battling to ensure that these organizations, they also abide by responsible data principles. And this is the part that is not very easy, because we are talking about some of our organizations who have offices in East Africa, and whose people who handle data, they don't have exposition to this type of debates and the best tools to handling data. And it's very often we receive, for example, data sets by email, because people think that email is private and just between us and them, or they share using Google Drive or Dropbox without being aware of all the implications of this type of sharing data. And also, I think when you talk about responsible data, we need to think about people who provide this data. And when you think about privacy and sensitivity of data, we need to understand the context that the data is coming from. So no one asks to people, are these data sensitive for you? So we, along with some opinions about governance and health, we also gather social demographic information. And something like only asking what's your gender can be very sensitive. If you're thinking of a context in, for example, in Somalia, that there's a shared phone between the man and the woman, and the husband doesn't see with good eyes that the woman, for example, talks in a public forum, and the woman just sends a message when the man is not at home. If you follow up with a question like, what's your gender? And the man said that there's an answer about, it's a female. So it's a sensitive context, and it provokes some problems between the couple. So I think we need to always to go to the context and evaluate what is like privacy and sensitivity of this data from the point of view of who is providing this data. Yeah.
Could I just ask though, perhaps if you could give some examples to make it more concrete of which kind of organisations or groups or entities might pose a threat if you're to the security of your data, if you're working in the context of Somalia, for example?
We can think about governments, of course, and we have been trying to work with governments directly, and we have not been successful. Doesn't mean that doesn't happen in the near future, but I think we want to make sure. I don't think it's a big threat at the moment, because this data is stored in Cambridge, and we also follow all these rules of not sharing data, and we have secure servers. And some data can be sensitive, but I would say like the sensitivity is also related to the possible data linkages. So for example, we don't store phone numbers, so it's impossible to track who this opinion is from. But people give, especially from very small communities, people give some personal information that maybe others in their communities can easily identify them. So I would say that this, who will be like the organizations or governments or people who could be interested in this kind of data and use this data for other purposes that not the purpose of the organizations and the research questions that we are going to ask to. I think we don't have an answer. I think as all type of data that allows to link with other data, we don't know in the future that we can have access to this data and get information from a different objective that we are thinking at the moment. So I think it's very difficult and very tricky, yes.
It was an interesting point you made about how you don't store, you have access to a piece of data from the phone numbers
yes.
of people who are texting in to
yes.
the radio stations, and you choose not to,
yes.
not to retain that. That's actually very different to the model that you were describing in terms of this constant pressure from the advertising world, from the big internet corporations, to sock up as much data as possible about everybody's, all their different aspects and facets of their lives. Maybe we could use this as a link perhaps to explore where did that come from? How did that idea that all of the different parts of our lives should be joined together in a way that can be linked through the data that we create? How did we get to this situation where that is so powerful and has such a large amount of technology attempting to enable it? Because that wasn't the case 10, 15, 20 years ago. If you think about the data protection regulations in this country, it's based on an assumption of that data is hard to collect, it's hard to link together, and a kind of parsimonious approach. You must only collect what's absolutely necessary. Why did that collapse?
I think mostly for tech reasons. The cost of collecting data has basically gone to zero. So, most apps and websites that you use can collect a huge amount of data basically for free, and it's also basically free to keep it around forever. Mm-hmm. It's usually cheaper to just keep things around forever than actually delete them. Just a small anecdote. When I was a PhD student, I got in this public spat with Facebook because I proved that they weren't actually deleting photos ever. When people requested to delete photos, they would just take down the link from your profile, but they would keep the photo in their database forever. And it came out in that process that it was more expensive for them to build a mechanism to actually delete people's photos than to just store every photo forever, even if people didn't want them to store it anymore. And 3 years later, they finally blogged and said, okay, we've taken the time to build a way to delete people's photos. Mostly for tech reasons, I think, is why most companies don't want to ever delete anything. But you can also argue just the incentives aren't there. They don't really get any benefit from collecting less data, and there's a chance that some extra data they've collected will turn into something useful. So, they're obviously going to respond to that incentive.
Would you say that the point that I've made about going from a parsimonious world of data collection to an overabundant one, is it the same process that's taking place in terms of genomics, or are there different drivers?
It's 100% driven by the economics of sequencing, right? Mm-hmm. When you have the Human Genome Project that takes more than a decade, and researchers all over the world and billions of dollars, and then now I can run 18,000 human genomes on an Illumina HiSeq in a year, and I can spend less than $1,000 per human, and I can go out and buy a hard drive to keep that on for effectively, $40, or I can store it, with a service provider for marginally more. It's the same drivers. The motivations behind why we're collecting that data are different and the same. Mm-hmm. They're different in that there's a huge amount of interest in putting together as much, and there's a belief that the more that we put together in the biomedical space, the more we'll be able to actually make meaningful correlations in an extraordinarily complex system. We sort of see that bearing itself out, but again, there's just we haven't had enough data points to know if that's really true yet, but we have this suspicion that it will, and we're working on this in areas like immunotherapies. But there's also the economic driver that goes behind this as well. So it's not purely altruistic, like, we want to understand and better characterize the population. There's going to be hugely valuable, economically valuable discoveries in centralizing, or at least combining, if not actually physically centralizing, all these different bits of omics. It's going to be a new, Amgen, just about a month ago, had a big spate of press about their latest drug, which is to treat heart disease, discovered out of the Icelandic population, and a data set they bought of Decode Genetics, which is a very large genomic data set. So, a blockbuster drug for heart disease is billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. So there's a bit of both going on there. I think in our way, I hope anyway, it's a bit more of a virtuous circle, right? Like, there is a definite drive to make these discoveries, and the fact that there's economic incentives as well furthers investment so that we can kind of figure some of this stuff out.
So I was going to say, should we put 23andMe on the table here as like the largest example? And I heard yes from somebody.
Who said yes?
Okay, so on the table. To me, that's a good example. It's maybe the link to my world, because that's the Silicon Valley version of genomic sequencing, and it's kind of a classic case.
Also conveniently not actually doing in-depth sequencing, doing kind of like low-grade sequencing.
Yeah. But their plan is basically keep the data around forever and hope they figure out a way to monetize it.
Absolutely.
In the future, right?
And they keep your spit too. So if they ever find an even cheaper way of doing, so right now they use SNP chips. We all know SNP chips versus whole genome sequencing. Raise our hands. Okay. Anyway, they do a very low quality. I'm trying to decide how much nerdiness we need in the room. Okay, let's do a quick vote. Lots of nerdiness. Vote. Low amounts of nerdiness. Lots of nerdiness. Okay. So 23andMe is using SNP chips, so they're looking for single nucleotide polymorphisms, individual bases that are different in a single human, and at certain positions. Now all the medical people in the Lauren, is this a decent explanation? Good. Okay. Looking for individual positions where there's a single nucleotide that's been flipped, and then that causes some sort of change in your phenotype, as opposed to whole genome sequencing, where we take everything, your whole set of DNA, 3.2 billion base pairs, we sequence the whole thing, coding and non-coding regions, and we sort of store all of that and then hope even more that there's something interesting there. Whole genome sequencing being used more often in research, SNP chips and et cetera are much cheaper and easier still. 23andMe makes, I don't know if they actually make money per test, but like Ancestry makes money per time they do something, and they're charging $100 for their SNP chip bit of sequencing, or genotyping really. So they're in a very similar position, and they have a huge set of data to work with. They haven't actually done all the sequencing yet, but you bet. But they're the one that are consumer visible, but they're by no means the least. AZ here, has anyone worked out in the new AC, the AstraZeneca stuff here just outside of Cambridge? They announced a month and a half ago they're going to sequence 2 million individuals over the next few years, and they're going to combine that data set, and they don't necessarily know exactly what they're going to find, but the stakes are in the ground. This is a race. So you have older pharmas like Regeneron that's been sequencing for quite some time, and anyway, it's exactly that. But 23andMe is this interesting, I would agree, in the crosshairs.
Maybe this is a good moment to perhaps open up for some questions from the audience.
Can I say one thing first? So there was the question Andrew asked earlier about like tech versus policy levers that I was trying to think of a more clear way to explain what I wanted to say. So there's been this analogy made between data collection and pollution. They're both kind of an externality of economic things that we want to do. I don't think it's a perfect analogy, but it goes a little bit of the way that there's kind of like Hail Mary solutions that the tech community might produce in both cases. We might invent cold fusion next year. And in the case of data collection, there are these sort of cryptographic equivalents, like fully homomorphic encryption is this theoretically really awesome thing. there's a bunch of technical reasons why it may never work, like cold fusion, but put it in that same bucket of like it would solve a lot of problems if it existed. It may never exist.
So too with magic.
Yeah. So, you know, like sometimes the response from government in both cases is, well, like let's wait until the much better technology exists and then we won't have to actually think about the policy question. And in both cases, it's probably prudent to say, well, we should really do what we can to emit less carbon and collect less data. And, you know, while we have the technology that we have, like we should sort of set policy assuming that technology is not going to radically change. If it does, awesome. You know, maybe we can avoid making a hard decision, but before then we, you know, probably should.
So on that note, then now I'm monopolizing my position here on the stage, but I'm going to ask one more question, which is, have you found any at all meaningful levers to actually do the education that you need to of the people that sit in the legislature? This is the thing that boggles my mind, and I have seen very little. Like, these people need a baseline understanding of what the technology is today. Yeah. They need a baseline understanding of what's being collected, and it's not, nor should it necessarily be assumed that they have this baseline understanding. And so, like, so if you're going to say policy is the lever you push, yeah. I'm asking you now how you push it.
So I think we are getting better. I think, like, you know, EFF is bigger and more organized than ever, and it's had more successful campaigns on things like the SOPA bill. So on the organization side, I think there is more of a lobby for privacy than there was previously. It has a long ways to go. I think we're also getting better
Lobbyists
about.
Are the answer?
Oh yeah, like we're a lobbying group, so it's funny like working for a lobbying group. 'Cause, you know, for a long time I'd assumed all lobbyists were evil. Then I'd realize, like, well, actually, like if you're lobbying for something that you think is good, like privacy and you know, people's online civil rights, then all of a sudden lobbying is your tool. But it's not just that, though. We've also gotten a lot more people placed in the U.S. government who are like real serious tech chops. Like my old postdoc supervisor at Princeton is deputy CTO in the White House now. The FTC and the FCC in the U.S. both have chief technologist positions that are filled kind of on a rotating basis from academic computer scientists. So we are making some progress at getting like more kind of outside technical advisors into government positions, but it's a long ways to go.